On this episode of Pilot's Discretion, we're talking with former White House speechwriter and current Cirrus owner James Fallows. He explains how he used his airplane to help write his latest book, how to talk to non-pilots about small airplanes, and how being a pilot has changed the way he talks. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, John Zimmerman of Sporties. A quick reminder before we get started to check out sporties.com/podcast for show links from today's episode and access to every other episode of Pilot's Discretion. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please hit that subscribe button and also leave a review to help others find the show. Finally, if you have guest ideas or comments, we're always available. Email podcast@sporties.com. Today's episode is one I've been looking forward to for a long time. I'm honored to have Jim Fallows with us, whose resume is enough to make even the most accomplished journalist blush. He was a Rhodes Scholar and a chief White House speechwriter before he turned 30, and since then he's gone on to write 11 books and thousands of articles for The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and many other outlets. He's now the author of a very good Substack newsletter called Breaking the News, which you should definitely check out if you haven't already. But more importantly for this podcast, Jim is a longtime pilot and Cirrus owner. In fact, I would argue he's done about as much as anyone recently to promote general aviation to a wider audience. Jim, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
John, it's a real pleasure to join you, and thanks for that very gracious intro.
For your most recent book, Our Towns, which you co-authored with your wife, Deb, you flew your Cirrus all across America, visiting more than 50 smaller towns. Why was a small airplane such a good way to do that research?
A small airplane was at the heart of what led Deb and me to all the articles we did for The Atlantic and elsewhere, and then our book, and then an HBO movie of that same name, Our Towns, which came out last year. And the reason it mattered is that I'll give you a brief backstory. We've been living in China for about 4 years before we came back to the U.S. in 2011. And in China, we tried our best to be on the road and get out of Shanghai and Beijing, where we were based, and see the provinces because the view was so different. And when we came back to the U.S. and settled back into our previous home of D.C., we recognized that in our past general aviation life, we'd had the same opportunity to see parts of the country that most people in the big cities or even smaller cities don't get a chance to see. That one of the many blessings of general aviation is letting you go places that are certainly not on hub airline routes. They're not on interstates, but they have their own stories and drama. So we thought, let's try that again. And so we started out back in 2013 with trips in South Dakota and in Michigan and up to New England. And we realized again there was something about the accessibility of the U.S. off the main airline routes and off the interstates that general aviation opened up to us. So if we hadn't had the plane and been exploring the country for a decade plus before that, we might not have realized the riches that were there to report on.
You write a lot in a lot of your articles with Our Towns about the role that local libraries play, which I thought was fascinating, and how they serve so many roles in communities. Maybe I'm reaching here, but is there any possibility that a local GA airport could in some small way serve one of those roles for the aviation community, where it's a source of connection and community for these cities?
That's a great connection, and you can hear in my pause, it's a connection I hadn't thought of before, but it makes sense as you say it. And again, a bit of backstory that one of the things my wife, Deb, who is a linguist by background and writer, emphasized during our travels and book was the way that libraries, seemingly an antiquated institution, had actually reinvented themselves in profound ways to become centers of community activity. And during the pandemic, they've been really magnified what they've done in many smaller communities, including offering broadband connections, which might be otherwise unavailable. And so you have something that many people might not have in the forefront of their minds, the public library, being an institution of this moment and connecting people in ways they might not otherwise be. I think all of us who've hung around FBOs and small airports over the years recognize the communities that are based there. And in our book, Deb has a really moving passage about an Easter banquet we unexpectedly had at a small FBO in Toccoa, Georgia, where we opened the door and there was a smell of ham and everything else, and people said, "Come in and join us on an Easter morning." But the FBO society in many places has been sort of aging out. It's people who were learned to fly in the 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s and have been connected around FBOs since then. I think it's an actually promising idea, now that you pointed out that FBOs could be in communities that rely on connections to the outside world, and where general aviation is one of those things, to have the FBO become the center of new generations of people interested in flying, of people who think about their community in a different way. And I'll say one other thing. A moment that is engraved in Deb's and my mind at the very beginning of our journey is, I think, the very first night we spent on the road was in the town of Red Oak, Iowa, which was a one-day trip we had made from D.C. when we were heading west. And we stayed in a little motel there. But when we got out of the plane at the Red Oak FBO, there was a troop of young aviation cadets, people who looked like they were maybe junior high school students or perhaps high schoolers who were learning to fly by some veteran, I think, crop duster pilot who was there. So we thought, this is promise for Red Oak, which was a surprisingly interesting community, and I think it does illustrate the promise you're talking about.
What do you think coming out of the pandemic, whenever that happens? There's a lot of talk about changing migration patterns. There's some research about people moving from larger cities to either suburbs or smaller cities. Seems like that would be a continuation of the story you've been telling. Selfishly, I'm interested in the general aviation role there, but do you think there's just a broader story there with some of these smaller towns getting renewed attention?
I think there is a broader story, which on the one hand, one shouldn't overemphasize. San Francisco will still be there despite all of the travails of living there. New York, I have been around long enough to see it go through ups and downs of everybody leaving New York and coming back to New York, et cetera, et cetera. And Washington, D.C., where I'm sitting right now, has certain locational things it can do as the seat of national government. But I think there have been times in U.S. history when you can see distinct changes in people thinking about where they live and how they live. Certainly the Dust Bowl era was one of those for tragic reasons, where people were driven from the south to the west and elsewhere. A generation before that, the Great Black Migration from the deep south to Detroit and Chicago and other places was a story of people seeking opportunity. In the 70s and 80s, there was kind of a Sunbelt migration. And I think people looking back at the early 2020s will also see some kind of change where you see more young people deciding that their overall life balance is better in Fresno than in San Francisco, or in Aberdeen or Sioux Falls than in Minneapolis, or in Allentown or Erie than DC or Pittsburgh, or whatever the pairing you'd want to come up with. So I think that we are going to I think people looking at our moment in history will see, how did, number one, the pandemic, number two, remote technologies, and number three, just people reconsidering their life, change where people decided to live on the landscape within the U.S. And I think that general aviation is going to be part of that too, because there are essential connective fibers or connective tendons that make it possible for people to live in places they might not have considered before. Broadband, I would say, is number one on that list, and there's still a great sort of inequality in that. Rural health is probably number two on that list. And I would say that general aviation is probably at least maybe tied for two and or number three of just being able to get places from where you are. If general aviation does make it possible to go places you might not have thought before. So I think that it can be part of this reconfiguration of people and the land.
You're not an aviation writer per se, but you're a well-known writer who discusses flying an awful lot in your stories, which I've always found interesting. So I imagine in that role, you probably answer questions about general aviation more than most, writers for The Atlantic, maybe. What's most striking about those conversations you have with non-pilots? What would surprise us as diehard aviation enthusiasts?
I think that I will say one caveat here is that a longtime friend of mine at the Atlantic and in general life has been William Langewish. And you can imagine the abashed feeling you have talking anything about aviation with William, who, of course, his first conscious memories are in the airplane with his father Wolfgang, and so he knows 100 times more about flying than all the rest of us have ever forgotten about flying. But for most other people, I think that there's several things that have I've learned over the decades. One is there's a real bimodal distribution of how, quote, normal, unquote, people think about general aviation. There are some people who are instantly attracted to the romance and the beauty of it and the sense of possibility. And this is the group of people who say, I don't have to ask them twice, would you like to come to a flight, on a flight? And they are, they leap at the opportunity and are just so excited and are rapt by it. Then there's the other group of thinking, are you kidding? That view any flight as essentially a roll of the dice about whether you're going to safely land, and just are terrified by the entire idea of general aviation. I think that's the product of several things. One is the fact that for people of my boomer vintage, the 1950s and 1960s was dominated by news of entertainers dying in small plane crashes. And these were, from the Big Bopper and Ricky Nelson and a million others, usually for terrible weather decisions and all the rest. But so there's that imprinted memory. There are enough sort of highlighted stories of high profile aviation catastrophes that people are aware of. And I think that the basic process of landing a plane still seems like either magic or impossibility to many people. In a post I recently wrote, I was describing it to learning to ride a bicycle. It's impossible until you know how. And then when you know how, it's not the hardest part of the flight, which is dealing with instrument conditions and all the rest. So I think that there has been, I've viewed one of my implicit low pressure sales maneuvers over the decades of just explaining to people how the process works, what makes it safe and what makes it not safe, and just the difference it can make in people's lives. And I'll say two other things if I could. I think something that people outside the community simply do not understand is the simultaneous existence of these two realities. One is statistically, as a realm of activity, general aviation is riskier than sitting at home on your couch. There are risks you accept in doing it. On the other hand, the risks are more foreseeable than they are in some other activities. If you're in a car, you have no control over the drunk driver who is going to hit you or other things that might happen. In an airplane, if you accept the premise, as I do, that most of the danger is weather, you have decisions about which flights you're going to make and not make. And that is, so it is simultaneously dangerous and more foreseeable in its dangers than other things people do. And I think recognizing both halves of that is not something that civilians, quote unquote, are experienced in. The other thing which I try to proselytize to civilians and sincerely believe myself is the unbelievable privilege of seeing the world from 2,500 feet up. And that when aviation was first invented and was much, much more dangerous than it is now, the idea was that every poet and writer and professor and artist would want to be a pilot because of the unique and human history, privilege of being able to see how the landscape fit together and see all of its beauties that way. People love going up in skyscrapers, and this is like a skyscraper that moves. And I think that is something that people, if they've had a chance to sit in the right seat or the back seat, they do recognize.
Yeah, you wrote a while back in one of my favorite passages. I'll quote it here at length because I think it directly applies to what you just said. Quote, "At the dawn of powered flight a century ago, it was assumed that writers and painters would want to become aviators, and vice versa. Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, Ernest K. Gann were flyers who wrote. Beryl Markham, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and Anne Morrow Lindbergh were writers who flew. because of the unique perspective on civilization and nature offered by the aerial view, end quote. So why do you think we don't have more of those writers? I mean, certainly lots of people write about it, you do, but why do you think that hasn't quite panned out? Is aviation just boring now because everyone accepts that it's normal?
So I think that point you make, the boringness and the just the unpleasantness of airline travel has made people think that being up in the air is something that you endure. And it's and I think that we recognize the miracle of safety in modern commercial aviation. That was something I wrote about in my book, China Airborne, of how the Chinese aviation system was trying to go from this genuine death trap situation a generation ago towards being quite safe. So we take for granted that airlines are safe, and we all know how unpleasant they are. They get us places we need to go, but no sane person enjoys the process unless you're in one of the fancy classes. So there is that that unpleasant baseline experience of what air travel means and what airports are like, and then there's the lack of large-scale familiarity that the broad training of a pilot corps during and after World War II created, when we had all these airports around the country, still many more than any other country, and all these people who had some kind of flying in their background. And now it does require, I think, there's the same quotient of people who are interested in the process, and there just are fewer opportunities for them. It is expensive, as we know. Around big cities, you have to drive someplace to get to an actual airport you can use. So I think that it's probably the World War II and the 15 years after that created a big cadre of people, in the non-military, but just, a group of people who were exposed to aviation as a normal activity. And it's worth thinking about ways to recreate that possibility if it can be.
You wrote in Free Flight a book in 2001, I believe, which is a really fascinating book for pilots, not just the general public. You describe sort of this emerging world of light jets and point-to-point flights, told through the stories primarily of Eclipse and Cirrus. One of those ideas mostly failed. One of those ideas mostly worked. Why do you think that is?
So it's thanks for remembering it. Historians of the publishing industry will know that this book came out in the summer of 2001.
Perfect timing.
Perfect timing. And there was a big disruption to aviation of all sorts in September of 2001, as we recall, with lasting effects in the TSA and every place else. And I think what was, just to spell it out for a moment, one of the stories I was telling was about the Klapmeyer brothers and their colleagues in first Wisconsin, then Minnesota, who came up with Cirrus, then Cirrus Design, now Cirrus Aircraft, which is now the best-selling plane of its type around the world, and whose parachute is accepted not as some device for sissies, but as a real safety advantage, et cetera, et cetera. And Cirrus has been through its So that was one of the themes. Another was of Eclipse, of course, which mainly, I would argue, in the subsequent financial disaster of 2008, 2009. That's what really put the death spike through the heart of that company, which had other troubles too. I also talked about NASA's role in this, and the way Bruce Holmes and other of his people at NASA had a guiding role of working with the companies. I think what the main argument of the book was, number one, commercial airline travel was reaching some kind of breaking point, of just for reasons of congestion and the ripple effect of anything that goes wrong, and just all the ways the margins had been removed from commercial aviation. It was safe but unpleasant and unpredictable and slow, and that simultaneously new technologies of GPS guidance and of small engines and of using new kinds of approaches that could be used in airports around the world were making a new kind of point-by-point possibility available. I think Cirrus endured the travails of the 2001 World Trade Center disaster and everything that happened to aviation after that. It endured and was changed by the 2008-09 financial collapse. That's when ownership was transferred to the Chinese Aerospace Ministry, which still owns the company, even though the planes are still built in Duluth, and went the tragic split between Alan and Dale Klapmeyer, which we can get into if you want. But the quality of their product and vision has made them a long-term commercial success. And I think NASA is still there trying to provide guidance for the next generation of electric, battery-powered planes and drones and all the rest. So I think the part of the vision that has most not succeeded is making point-to-point jet transport affordable. It is still wildly popular for people of means. I think the biggest convenience difference between being rich and not is being able to have your own jet plane. So that vision works, but only for the rich people, and only for people who can reasonably afford to get a jet. And the Cirrus vision has worked in terms of applying safety technology and guidance technology and comfort within the plane and et cetera. And so it's a different situation in detail from what I was expecting 20 years ago when writing the book, but the ball has moved down the field.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels, as you mentioned, with this next generation of electric aircraft, VTOL. I know you emceed a conference recently on that topic with air taxis and all that. Do you think that concept is going to work this time around? Do you think there are some different technologies or businesses or models there that are going to make this successful?
So I do not know enough about either the technology or the market conditions to make a firm prediction about either Boom's supersonic technology or the Hyperloop kind of alternatives to high-speed rail that are being proposed. I do think that battery-powered relatively short-haul VTOL transport really seems like a natural. Number one, the technology is advancing very, very rapidly. That batteries, that we know what's happening with cars and with Tesla and other things. We know what's happening in remote devices. We know about grid storage, where all these things are pushing batteries, not quite in a Moore's law level of improvement, but in a very significant level of improvement. And that makes, so having environmentally much more sustainable kind of transportation for these city to city or within city routes is technologically it's being driven. You would think that would make it economically, again, not a tool simply of the top 1%. And as say helicopters going from Manhattan to the Hamptons might be now, or across Los Angeles. So if you can have a premium priced but not super elite, environmentally endurable, practical way to get across the Los Angeles basin, or from north of the Golden Gate to south of the Golden Gate, or across New York or whatever. And if new technologies of guidance can make it practical to have a sky full of these devices that are not running into each other, which ADS-B should make feasible, and without having current air traffic control be quite as overwhelmed as it would be without ADS-B. I think there is a foreseeable future for these for getting from place to place for distances of 10 or 50 or 80 miles with battery-powered transports that can take off and land without airports.
Jim, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with some more questions.
Earn your pilot's license, get current, or add a rating. No matter what your goal is, Sporty's pilot training app will save you time and money. It's available on all your devices, including iPad, iPhone, Android, and smart TVs, so you can access Sporty's award-winning videos anywhere. Plus, with automatic sync between platforms and free lifetime updates, you'll always be up to date. Over 25 courses are available, from private pilot to aerobatics. Visit sportys.com/courses to try it free. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
All right, we're back with Jim Fallows, and I want to bring up your wife. You mentioned Deb as a linguist and a lover of language. She wrote a great article a few years back about the jargon of aviation and how it affects pilots' everyday lives. And this, to me, every listener of this podcast is going to start nodding their head, because she wrote about how you changed when you became a pilot. You used to say, "What was that?" or "Sorry," and instead you would say again, which is something I've noticed. I'll tell my kids Roger or Wilco instead of yes. So what other ways has being a pilot changed your daily habits like that?
So it is true that Deb, Deb is not herself a pilot, even though she was a competitive racing sailor. The reason is, from my point of view as her husband, her eyes are beautiful and yet not functional. She is legally blind in some states, and so our common discourse when we're on final approaches, I'll say, "Well, there's the runway," and she'll say, "Where?" Which directions. But she is an expert in language and loves hearing the lingo of the air and the air traffic controllers, especially. She's written about this several times, the way in which air traffic control becomes consciously more calm as the situation becomes more tense, and that there is a kind of, that is something that she really notices and we all appreciate. I think the habit of saying, say again, is one that predictably makes her roll her eyes at me. I do, compared to 10 or 15 years ago, I do answer Wilco in emails much more than I did before. I think the general public doesn't understand the differences among Roger, Wilco, and standby. That there are, I think nobody in the general public understands that standby means don't talk. So I try not to use that in the general public. But I think that the main way I like aviation because of something that spreads over to my normal life and something that doesn't spread over to my normal life. The part that doesn't spread over to my normal life, and the reason I first so much loved getting into this 25 years ago when I started doing it seriously, is that I was then in a very, very high-stress job as the editor of a weekly news magazine, and I needed some way not to think about that for at least some period of the day. And going out in a plane was something that made me conscious, focus on the moment. I had to be, as they say, be here now in the cockpit. And now, and also 2 minutes from now. What's the airplane going to be doing in 2 minutes or in 30 seconds or whatever? And so I still very much love the idea that when I'm in an airplane, I am thinking about that airplane. And I'm thinking about this moment, and I'm looking out. I'm wondering what are the 5 things that might happen I need to worry about, and what's the next 3 things to do, and the next 3 frequencies, the next weather in the next place. And I love that enforced immersion in something that is not my normal life. The part that does come over to my normal life is that thinking about the web of events and phenomena that might affect me. That I never used to care about the weather. I now spend all my time thinking about the weather and what front is moving in and blah, blah, blah. And so I'm thinking about what I love about piloting is the combination of weather and simple mechanics and technology and history and the visual and the tactile and all these things that come together. And I think the interaction of all those different disciplines and senses, I think, has affected my writing about some things, of just being aware of the contact points and the tapestry and the mosaic and the overlays and whatever other image you want to use, of the connections among things that come together in the stories that we tell. And speaking of storytelling, an introduction to the piloting world, of course, is there I was. And so I try never to begin any article or even any paragraph with the words "there I was."
Yeah, I think your point about weather is so true. I know I often get accused of walking around with a live updated weather map in my head, and non-pilots ask me, well, when's it going to start raining, and how much snow we're going to have. I also think the general concept of risk management transfers over, and I'm not a big risk management the way maybe the FAA teaches it, but just the concept that life is not without risk, and every decision you make is at heart some trade-off between risk and reward. And I know, especially over the last 2 years, I think a lot of people have started thinking about risk differently, but I've found just the mindset of a pilot, of how you approach that, has really informed other parts of my life, and I've been glad to have it. So
that is a very good point, which again, I hadn't thought of but recognize as you say it. And we were talking earlier about the general public sense that they have often a zero risk view of general aviation. We should never get in those planes because we're never getting out of them. And I think the management and assessment and awareness that you never get to zero, but there are things that are within your control and out of your control. And one other thing you mentioned earlier, a quote where I mentioned Ernest K. Gann. Of all the books about aviation, I think Fate is the Hunter really stays with me because of its meditations on risk. There are things you can control and things that you cannot. And that is also life. And so that is a way in which the calculations, but also the surrender that you must do as a pilot, those apply to life too.
in your book, China Airborne, which you mentioned earlier, you wrote about how the surge of private wealth in China and sort of the far-flung cities seemed to set itself up well for general aviation. And as we know, that didn't happen. And there's lots of reasons I think everybody has talked about. Your perspective, though, someone who's lived there, someone who's flown there, probably one of the few people who's flown a Cirrus in China, what do you think the story is there?
I think there are two main issues about why. There's a saying about some countries, the land of tomorrow and always will be. I think that's sort of how I've come to think about the potential for general aviation in China. One theme is the reason I wrote that book after living in China for a number of years, is that you can write about China either in the giant macro perspective, the saga of 5,000 years, or you can say, here is a story which is the universal in the micro. And that's what I thought about aviation in China, because to have a successful aerospace establishment, you need to do so many other things well. You need to manage risk. You need to have universities work with companies, work with the government. You need to have the military be involved, blah, blah, blah. It's a more impressive and complicated achievement than one would think. And so if China could do that, that would be a proxy for a lot of other things that were within their capacity. And so that's why I wanted to examine the possibilities. The specific reason why it hasn't happened in China is one of those, which is military, civilian, commercial relations. When I first got to China in 2006, first living there, I'd been there a number of times before, I was talking with some of my friends there saying, let's set up some GA flights. And you look at the maps, such maps or the charts, such VFR charts as you can find that are not classified top secret, or you get them smuggled in somehow. As a side note, GPS in China is not allowed to be accurate for security reasons. For example, their Uber or their counterparts, you couldn't really call them with a GPS location because by national security laws, they couldn't be accurate. So that was a factor too. But you look at these charts, and they were just the reverse of U.S. charts, or in the East Coast, where in the U.S. there's some parts that are military and the rest that's not. In China, there's a couple little parts that are not military and everything else is. And just for national security paranoia, the military controls almost all the airspace in China, starting at very low altitude and extending everywhere. That's one reason why airline travel in China is always behind schedule. He has to take these big dogleg routes around airspace. The military controllers won't release the flights, even from Shanghai and Beijing, etc. So 15 plus years ago, when I first got there, I was hearing from a lot of the aviation enthusiasts, the military airspace is about to be opened. And now in 2022, the military airspace is about to be opened. And we will see when that actually occurs.
Okay, Jim, at the end of each one of these episodes, we always like to close with some rapid fire questions, a segment we call Ready to Copy. So I'll throw out some topics. You give me your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
Ready to copy.
You mentioned Ernest Gann earlier, and as a writer, I'm very curious to know your pick for best aviation book, obviously excluding your own. Is it Fate is the Hunter? Is it Wind, Sand, and Stars? Something else? What's your pick?
So Fate is the Hunter has a special place in my mind. I will mention my friend William Langowish's Inside the Sky, which the title itself is great and sort of is a metaphor for the different way you view the world as from above than on the ground.
You've written about, and you mentioned it earlier when talking about getting into flying, but I thought a great phrase you use, which is the curse of continual partial attention, where everybody's sort of always sort of paying attention, but never 100%. Is flying a cure for that, or has technology encroached on our peaceful world up there?
I think it was my friend Linda Stone who I believe came up with a continuous partial attention, which is the curse of the modern era. And yes, I think that it is possible to be distracted while in a cockpit because of all the devices. But I still find it, of the times in my day or week or month where I'm most focused on this right now, is still inside the sky, inside the cockpit, looking around and looking at what's next.
You've lived all over the world, Asia, Africa, Europe. What was your favorite stop along the way?
This is like my favorite children and grandchildren.
Exactly.
I will say that nothing matched in romance, I think, the couple of years we spent in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. This was in the mid-1980s when our kids were elementary school age. It was still we lived in a former rubber plantation bungalow that was right on the main grass horse racing track in downtown Kuala Lumpur. And every afternoon we'd have this herd of thundering horses roar around the track. And sometimes I would myself run laps on that same grass track, which convinces you how fast horses are.
Another question about favorites. I'll put you on the spot again. In Our Towns, you wrote a lot about craft breweries. And so I'm wondering if you have a favorite one from your travels.
I will have to give pride of, this is a pride of ancestry answer. I'm from a town in California called Redlands, a small town near San Bernardino. San Bernardino now has this giant airport that used to be an Air Force base, now San Bernardino International. In 2008, I was living in China, but in 2008, my father, my beloved father, was dying in Redlands. I made a number of trips back and forth from Beijing to Southern California to see him. And in the evening, after seeing him in the hospital, I would go to the first craft brewery that opened in my hometown, which was at the Redlands Airport. It was called Hangar 24. And so it was the first time I'd seen a craft brewery at an airport. And so that brewery has been through lots of ups and downs since then. Redlands itself has come up with a wonderful new brewery called Escape that I actually prefer now. But I will always think of the night after night I spent at Redlands Airport watching Hangar 24 craft brewery emerge while I was on this final watch with my dad. So that has, of the 1,000 places I've been, that's one that has a special place in my mind.
Craft brewery at an airport. I think we could all sign up for that. Another fascinating part of your history that I had forgotten until reading about it was the 6 months you spent as a consultant at Microsoft working on Word. So I want your pick. What's the most underrated feature of Word that we should all be using that we're probably not?
There's everybody who uses the track changes feature. That was something I was involved in developing when I was there. And of course it's indispensable. And my role was to try to explain to a number of people who are engineers and who didn't write more than emails or code what people who did actual writing would like to see in terms of corrections and suggestions and all of that. So that is a deservedly popular feature of Word. Side note, for anybody who writes things longer than emails, the indispensable word processing tool is something called Scrivener. It's developed by a tiny company in Western England. It's It is a brilliant tool for organizing books, articles, anything I do that's longer than a paragraph or two. I write in Scrivener and then export to Word. The feature of Word that people don't know to give thanks for missing is Clippy. This is the little device that used to come up saying, hey, it looks like seems like you're writing a letter. And your answer after the first time is, go to hell, Clippy. And so when I was at Microsoft, I was part of a team that removed Clippy from the universe.
We all owe you an eternal debt of gratitude for that. Clippy deserves its place in the dustbin of history forever. A final random question, as we like to do in this podcast, but a subject I know is very close to your heart. Tell me why leaf blowers are so bad.
Leaf blowers, gas-powered two-stroke leaf blowers, are the most polluting equipment still in legal use in the United States. Running one of them for a half hour in terms of most kinds of emissions is like driving a pickup truck across the country. And this is not even to mention the unique sound signature noise they create, which penetrates walls and windows and is medically damaging, especially to the crews who use them. There is a famous audiologist whom I've quoted in print saying that every time he sees a crew using leaf blowers, he thinks 10 years from now, these people will be deaf, and who will be taking care of them then? I speak to you from Washington, D.C., which as of January 1st, 2022, is leading the nation in outlawing either the sale or use of gas-powered leaf blowers and subsidizing and giving incentives for a shift to battery equipment, taking advantage of the same battery revolution, which will give us point-to-point VTOL transportation around the country. So if Clippy was a nuisance, leaf blowers have been a menace, and 10 years from now, people will marvel that they were ever legal at all.
From Clippy to leaf blowers, that's exactly the content we aim for on this podcast. So, Jim, our last question is always the same on Pilot's Discretion. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
I'm flying a jet-powered Cirrus, which I aspire to, but I'm not in the bracket to possess. And I'm flying to one of the two hometown airports of my two sons. Either the Santa Barbara airport, where I've landed many times, where one of my sons lives, or Love Field at Dallas, which is about 2 miles away from where my other son lives and their family. So that would be my ambition. But maybe actually I'd want to do it in a lower and slower craft to be able to savor one last trip across the landscape, which is the real reward of this passion we all share.
Jim, thanks for being on the podcast.
John, it's an honor and privilege. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporty's Pilot Shop, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and links to additional information, visit sportys.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.